Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Steve Matthews with ActiveNav, SVP of Global Accounts. I have been with ActiveNav for a good number of years now and have really seen the market evolve from the early days of information governance through to the more sophisticated and advanced programs and techniques that organizations are employing and deploying today.
And I'm Gary Rylander, and I'm Managing Director of Professional Services at Iron Mountain, North America. And I've been playing with natural language processing, for almost 20 years now. Things are getting really exciting in this day and age as folks are finally taking seriously the need to and the ability to manage unstructured information through marvelous tools such as active navigation. Steve, or is this my slide?
It's yours, Gary.
It's mine. All right. We only rehearsed this 3 times. So every time we talk to a company, we find, not surprisingly, that they have a retention schedule. Most recent data shows that 92% of companies have a records retention schedule. Yet every time we show up in a company or another type of organization, a government organization, and we look at what is sitting around on their share drive, SharePoint, etc., we find that approximately 70% of the content is redundant, obsolete, or trivial, and only 5 or 10% are records. And you know, these numbers have been bandied about now for close to a decade. Originally, it was the CGOC that did a survey in 2012 that came up with this magical 70% that you always hear. But in fact, in real life, every time we do it, it turns out that it's about right. That's typically what we see. So what Steve and I are going to discuss today is how did we get here and what can we do about it? If you talk to folks in the records management and information governance community, it's plainly obvious that everybody feels that the volume of information, the speed at which it accumulates, basically require that the only way that anybody can declare and classify information is through some sort of automation. This AIM survey from a few years ago demonstrates that. Many others do as well. Yet in 2019, which is the last time that ARMA and Cohasset did a survey in this area, they found that only about 5% of people were using fully automated mechanisms to classify share drives and collaboration tools like SharePoint, and only a few percent more were doing that even for content and document management systems, which is sort of amazing since almost every one of them have an automated file plan that allows you to completely automate disposition. But that is the way it is. So why is that? We actually think that there are 5 challenges that undermine the ability to classify information. One is the number of categories that people are classifying or trying to classify into. Second is the fact that these categories are record classes, and they're not always record classes because the same problems exist if you're classifying into a taxonomy for knowledge purposes as if you're trying to classify into a retention schedule, but overlapping, poorly defined categories. Third is the size of the training set that is required if you use machine learning-based classification methods. Next is the availability of those training sets to be used. And finally is the availability of subject matter experts to help lead you through all of that training material. Steve, anything you want to add to this?
Certainly is, Gary. And to flip this on its head somewhat, here at ActiveNav, we take a slightly different approach to the classification problem, because what Gary has outlined here is actually very resource intensive, both from internal resources as well as computing resources. And so here at ActiveNav, we're very much looking at how can we minimize a disruption to the business and enable the business to achieve its overarching goals without becoming paralysis by analysis. And as we go through this presentation this afternoon, we're going to give you some ideas about how we actually undertake that and help organizations manage this previously unmanageable problem.
Okay, so let's start with the number of record classes. Today, only 26% of respondents to the Cohasset survey, which is a pretty good cross-section of the records management world, only 26% have fewer than 50 record classes, and 74% have 100 to 500 record classes. And everybody wants fewer record classes, and they are coming down over the years. If we looked at this number half a dozen years ago, it would have been higher, but still 100 to 500 record classes is quite a few, and quite a few more than you probably want to use to classify information against it.
If you go back one, please, Gary, a couple of comments on this. One of the challenges that we've seen, and this is why ActiveNav does take a slightly different approach to the classification problem, the data classification problem, is that one of the challenges we see is, first of all, if you have a large number of record classes, you can be constantly training the system. The other challenge that we have, and this is particularly true, for example, the last 6-9 months during the COVID era, nothing stays the same for very long. And in order to be able to identify content about a particular pattern, it means that you're constantly having to reteach the system, which also means you have to know everything about your data. And one of the things that we certainly find in the market is we haven't come across a single organization that can hand on heart say, we know everything about the data that we've stored or captured over the last 20, 30 plus years.
There really is a rule of thumb about how much data you need to train an algorithm. If you were to Google 10x rule of thumb and data sample or training set size, you'd actually find that there really is a 10x rule of thumb. And what that 10x rule of thumb says, and of course it's a rule of thumb, which means it could be 5x, it could be 15x, depending upon the problem domain. What that rule of thumb says is, for 100 record classes, you need 100 times 10 or 1,000 exemplars per record class. So if you go back to the 74% of people who have 100 to 500 plus record classes, those folks are going to need at least tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 or more exemplars in order to train the algorithm to classify their unstructured information at appropriate levels of accuracy in terms of what they're looking for. Steve, anything?
Yeah, certainly have. And this is one of those classic catch-22 situations. You need to know what you don't know, but do need to know. And this is a game where we can get into paralysis by analysis. If you don't know what your true data inventory or data map really is, how can you identify those really well-defined documents that would help train and form part of the traditional machine learning? You really have to have a really good handle on what your data is truly about, not what you believe it should be about. We very often find that there's a big disconnect between what an organization believes their data should be about, and then we're able to carry out our discovery and data mapping, what it truly represents. Because again, things change all the time, and particularly over the years. So what could be identified as a contract document over the last 6 months, 3 years ago, a contract document could look very, very different from today. And so being able to understand your total data estate, what types of data are supremely important to being able to identify the exemplars.
So next we get to the challenge of overlapping categories. I do a lot of work in financial services, And I regularly look at client retention schedules that have W-4, W-2 forms, potentially in multiple record classes. It could be in a loan origination file. It could be in an HR file. It could be in a litigation file. And absent knowing the context of where that document was found, which is frequently the case, you wouldn't necessarily know where to put it. And you find those kinds of overlaps or redundancies regularly when you look at a retention schedule. If you have a retention schedule like that, this isn't purely a technology problem. People wouldn't necessarily know where to put it either, unless they found it in the context of a file that showed, this is a legal file, this is a mortgage origination file, etc. But as you think about whether you're using our approach or a machine learning approach, when you think about your retention schedule and what you want to class, and the fact that you want to use it as a basis of classification, ultimately you want to try and clean it up, normalize it, clean up the terminology so that at the end you have a set of record classes that are really separated like that. And there are even mathematical measures such as k-means that you can use to measure the terms in your record class names, your example names, so that you can see how separated are the individual categories.
And I think again here, Gary's alluded to this, is the right-hand side. I'm sure if you're colorblind, there might be numbers or something in there, but this is the challenge. You want it to look very clear cut, like on the left-hand side under the optimized categories, but life is very rarely black and white. And so again, being able to understand what type of data you have, both historical as well as current, being able to minimize that fuzziness and those blurred edges will minimize the disruption to the business and, more importantly, the business users. Because if you imagine that you've come up with a strategy and it looks very much like the right-hand side, the unoptimized categories, where you could have a single file and it says, well, it could be any one of these 5 record classes. Well, the reality is you're going to need someone to review that to make a determination about what's the most appropriate record class. And if you can't put clear water between each of the categories, that's going to be an awful lot of content that needs to be reviewed by somebody in the business. Somebody in the business that really doesn't have the time outside of their day-to-day job to be able to review hundreds of thousands, if not millions of files to determine the most appropriate category. So getting rid of that fuzziness, getting rid of those blurred edges, and creating that clear daylight between the categories is super important. And again, this all comes back to really, truly having a better understanding of what your data is about.
Well, Steve already alluded to this problem. I saw it in engagement a couple of years ago for a client of ours that was facing an SEC action for failure to properly manage its records under the SEC Broker-Dealer Books and Records Act. And even in that fairly dire situation, the subject matter experts had day jobs. We didn't use active navigation for that. We used a traditional naive Bayes type of algorithm. And in order to use that algorithm, we needed exemplar documents. But the SMEs had day jobs. They had loans to and brokerage deals to work on. They didn't want to work on this. So they sort of tossed us some documents that they thought were representative of what we were looking for. And they didn't understand the problem that we were really trying to solve. They didn't know the domain space. And fortunately, in this case, there are only 23 categories of records that are required under 17A3 of the Broker-Dealer Books and Records Act. So we managed to get around it. But if you're dealing with lots and lots of categories, you have exactly the problem that we've been talking about. Steve?
Yep. And again, what we typically have seen, and I'm sure most of the attendees on this webinar will have seen this in their own workplace environments, is organizations can mandate that users, when they save documents or save it to a repository such as SharePoint or some other records management system, they absolutely have to select a records category, the manual tagging approach. Big challenge with that is what we have seen time and time again is you might have a small portion of the user base that is very methodical about how they will classify or tag a document at point of saving it. The vast majority of people in an organization are going to say, this is too much hassle. I'm going to pick the first thing in the list. And so it's typically, it will be classified as something that begins with an A as it's the first letter in the alphabet, typically administration or something similar, even if it's a finance document or something similar. So again, this is one of those catch-22 situations. You want the content to be categorized correctly. You want to minimize how much effort the people in the organization have to expend. How do you actually do that?
And finally, we have the problem of data access. And this is an issue with machine learning, but really not for our approach. And the problem is, if you go in and use pretty much any kind of machine learning algorithm, naive Bayes, convolutional neural net, random trees, etc., you're going to need those documents to train the algorithm. But once you've trained the algorithms for client A is not going to permit you to take their documents, even if you anonymize them, and take them and go use them at client B, to use them as a starting training set. So invariably, what happens is if you're using a machine learning algorithm, most vendors are going to start out with an untrained, naive set of algorithms, which you will need to train from scratch using your training data set. And that is something that we eliminate in our approach.
And
Steve?
the way that we do that is that we have the ability to carry out what we might term as a blind discovery, not to be misconstrued as anything to do with e-discovery. But the key thing here is that we don't need to know all of the answers before we start. So we can actually help you better understand what your data is really about, what's the important information, what might be redundant. And by looking at each of those individual files means that we can start honing in on the information or the data of real interest that can help us build out the patterns and map content based around the data classification challenges. And that really comes to a point of, wow, there's an awful lot we need to consider. There's an awful lot we need to do to get this right. Where on earth do we start? Well, the good news is between ourselves, between ActiveNav and Iron Mountain, we have a working methodology and process that has been deployed at well in excess of 100 different large clients just in the US alone. And what this enables us to do is to build out a roadmap, because just like anything, if you try and eat that elephant in one sitting, you're going to get terrible indigestion. So let's break it down into manageable chunks. And so we have this process, methodology, and workflow that gives us the best bang for the buck. The first thing is to carry out this discovery, understand what data exists, where it exists, what looks like it's potentially redundant, obsolete, trivial, rot, as we call it. Because typically that will be 30 to 40% plus just in that first pass. And that's really important, because if you can reduce the size of the haystacks that you're looking through, it means that we can really focus our attention on what really matters. Not just that, it means that we're not training a system or teaching the system to classify data based on junk. We can really look for that important information. Then we can build out rules. As Gary has alluded to, we provide a raft of rules out of the box. We also integrate with Iron Mountain's Policy Center solution, PCS. That means that we can take those existing records retention schedules and map content to it. And this then allows us to build out rules, custom rules for clients that mean that we can do a much better job of mapping data to the appropriate parts of the retention schedule as it relates to that individual client. rather than having a one-size-fits-all and trying to have a broad brush approach that says everything in finance, no matter who the organization is, we're going to have this single answer because it works. Well, every organization is different. Every organization uses different terminology. You need some flexibility and approach that's going to work on a client by client and even department by department basis. And this is really where this kicks in. As part of this process, we'll create all of this information as metadata. And that metadata can then be used by platforms such as Microsoft's 365, so that we can identify record classes and pass those to the record center. And we have a whole degree of flexibility that allows the organization to control how this information gets classified, the process and what level of effort is required by the internal organization, and also the ability to modify or change the results from the ActiveNav process if you wish to override those results. So there's an awful lot of flexibility, but again, all about minimizing that disruption.
So if you think about a typical retention schedule, they're usually so-called 3 tiers of information. There's a functional level, which in this case is called classification. So audit and compliance management is a functional area of a business. Then you have record classes or sub-classification. So you'll have internal accounting controls, related documents, audit and compliance policies and procedures that are record classes. And then you'll have particular examples of each type. And this is not unique to what Iron Mountain does. It's pretty standard in records management. So what we do is we can map all of those 3 levels into active navigation. So the functional areas get mapped in as the same as they are in the retention schedule, and then the record classes beneath that, and then the record examples beneath that. And what happens is when we're finished, so in this example, if we've imported in an Iron Mountain set of record classes for general business entities, and I think there are about 75 record classes typically that apply to pretty much every kind of business, that will turn into a complete set of 105 calculated fields and extraction rules inside active navigation that we can then use to classify against. And I should add that this takes less than an hour. The magical thing about doing this, as opposed to going around to the subject matter experts and collecting the tens of thousands of training documents before you start, is we can import a rule set like this inside of an hour and be classifying, and then do a handful of workshops to validate that the results are what they're looking for, and then to fine tune it a little bit. But even out of the box, without any fine tuning, this is an example of what you'll get. This is the infamous Enron email data set, which everybody in our business uses to benchmark things. And if you were to just import a general business entity retention schedule and run the Enron documents against it, you'll find that the overwhelming number of documents came up with no value, which is another way of saying they didn't end up being classified against any particular record class, whereas small numbers did get classified against a variety of different record classes. Steve, did you want to add something to this?
I think you covered it perfectly there, Gary.
All right. So if you look at this in totality, so the Enron email set has 517,000 files, 487,000 are non-records, 29,000 are records, which gives us a matching value of 5.8%. Records managers will tell you that this is just about what you would expect. You would expect usually from 5 to 15% of the documents floating around an organization to be records, and that's all. I mean, a little bit higher on the financial side, lower in a less regulated industry. So the first time I saw this, I said, that's pretty interesting result for a minimal amount of work. And that's really what we've been seeing since then as we've worked with active navigation. And this is a lot.
Just before you move on from that, Gary, I saw a chat message just come through. So I don't know if we're meant to leave those to the end or not, but from Jennifer asking about, for those that are no value, how do we actually confirm that they're not official records? And I would suggest that, or would say, that's really where some random sampling comes in, because as you saw through the bar chart, there were several 100,000 that had no value. So again, we don't want people to have to review several 100,000 or millions of files. And so we very much look at a sampling process to get that comfort and that statistical relevance to make sure that, yes, we can feel confident these are not official records. And even though they may not be official records, it doesn't mean that we have to get rid of that data immediately. Quite the opposite. We can still have a retention period for non-records. And so it's not that if we don't see something as an official record, we're going to get rid of it now. We don't have to do that.
And the getting that validation, Jennifer, is really straightforward. We would look at the data set of, true, we'd select what was true positive, true negative, false positive, and false negative based upon what we'd seen, and we'd send a random sample to end users. And the way we would do that is we download it into a spreadsheet with links into the actual documents that had been classified. And if they thought the classification was wrong, they'd use a drop down on the spreadsheet to indicate that. But we would do that based upon rigorous statistical sampling, based upon the margin of error that you would find acceptable, the confidence interval in achieving that margin that you're looking for, and that would tell us how many we need to send out for validation. So this is an actual live example. This is a proof of concept pilot that we did together, Active Navigation and Iron Mountain. And this is an insurance company in Europe. And what we found was pretty much what we've been talking about. 79% of what we looked at were rot and non-records. 5 or 6%, whether you look at it by files by percentage or by size, 5 or 6% were records, and 16% looked like they were records. They classified against the retention schedule, but they were younger than 2 years old. And this particular organization had a policy that said you did not need to declare something as a record until it was 2 years after the date of creation. So we see this on a fairly regular basis. And when you see something this consistently, it begins to tell you that it really does operate this way in many different environments.
And this is very much in line with what we see elsewhere. And so very few files, proportionally, really get determined as official records. By the same token, most organizations are extremely conservative with regards to what data they will purge. Many organizations have a great fear, even if legal approve it, of hitting that big delete button, just in case. And so one of the strategies that we recommend to organizations to deploy is, if you're not comfortable with truly hitting that big delete button, even if you have the approval to do it, we can look at a triage process, or you should look at a triage process, whereby data that's deemed surplus requirements, put it into a quarantine location that the end users from the business can't actually see. And if they don't squawk for that data within a certain period of time, whether it's 90 days, 180 days, whatever the organization is comfortable with, then you can pretty much have a high degree of confidence it's safe to purge that data, or people would be screaming for it. And so again, don't look at this as a problem where it's binary. You either keep everything for a set period of time or get rid of things as quickly as humanly possible, because there will be pitfalls. And we have clients where they have convenience copies spread across the organization. What do I mean by convenience copies? Well, these might be data extracts from some structured application or system. So the official record exists in that application, but they have exported or created these CSV files that contain a wealth of data, which quite often will contain a lot of PII. And those are immediate things that, well, these are convenience copies. We can look at removing these. As our clients have found, a lot of applications have been created in the past and even in right now, and not really actually been configured particularly well. And actually, if you remove those CSV files from a shared drive where they shouldn't be, it can actually damage or break links within the application. And so again, having this ability to have this triage process means that we can avoid some of the challenges around there. And I can see that Mark Allen has just raised a question, sort of saying that it's set up so that users are notified, do nothing, it is gone. I think that is certainly a very interesting approach. And this really fascinating part of this whole process is it's not all about technology. It's about people, process, and technology. And the psychology of this is particularly interesting. What we certainly have experienced is the moment you tell people things have gone, they scream, "Oh my gosh, what have you done? We need that data." If you don't tell them it's gone, they don't even notice it's not there. So it's a real interesting conundrum, and be really interested in Mark's experiences as to how well that has worked.
So I have to admit, I come from a world of artificial intelligence and machine learning. I was at IBM for 15 years. I used all manner of machine learning algorithms and natural language processing tools to try to extract meaning from a blizzard of data in media and entertainment, military and intelligence applications, financial services. And when I first came upon active navigation, I was highly skeptical. But I saw through my own eyes and on the engagements that we've done together how effective it is and how much less effort is required to get to acceptable levels of accuracy using the active navigation approach. But when Steve and I began to work together to put together this presentation, which we actually presented for the first time earlier in the year, I went out and did a little research, and I found this fascinating article by a group of academicians who published it in the BMC Medical Informatics and Decision Making Journal. And they call the article "A Clinical Text Classification Paradigm Using Weak Supervision and Deep Representation." And what they mean by weak supervision is essentially what we've been talking about here. The idea of using natural language, regular expressions, phrases, keywords, rules, linked together with Boolean connectors is a way of tagging things. And by deep representation, they mean a variety of different machine learning algorithms. And the use case that they tested all of this against was a set of clinical use case, clinical documents across 3 different use cases. So what they did was they first went and they, using a knowledge base and doing workshops and interviews with end users, they built a set of rules similar to what we would have in a records retention schedule, because as records managers, we start out by going around the organization and finding out, gee, what records do you have in this department? What records do you have here? Which is pretty much the same sort of exercise. And then they ran those documents, a set of those documents, through those rules, and they ended up with clinical data with what they call weak labels. And then they took the clinical data with weak labels and ran it against 4 different machine learning algorithms. And then they tested that against previously unseen clinical data sets. And I'll sort of preface what I'm about to show you with something that you may well be aware of, but 80% of the effort in any sort of AI big data effort is all around data cleanup. Because if we're seeing redundant, obsolete, and trivial information make up 70% of the documents for retention purposes, and then we're seeing the same thing for big data analytics purposes. So it's a pretty well-known fact that so-called data wrangling, data cleanup, and unification is a major effort because most of our data is so nasty to begin with. So when you do what I've just described and you use tag data, what happens is, and this is a bit of an eye chart, pardon me, so there were 3 use cases they looked at. And the first one, the rules-based natural language processing, which is what we're talking about, it achieved an F1 score of 91. F1 is the harmonic mean of precision and recall, and is a typical way that you assess the accuracy of classification. In contrast to that, support vector machine achieved an 80% F1 score, random forest 81, MLPNN, which I forgot what it stands for, is 85, and convolutional neural net 92. So out of the box, our approach, a weak supervision approach, achieved the second highest score, almost as good as convolutional neural network, which is sort of the gold standard these days of what people think of when they think of machine learning. It's what's behind Siri, what's behind Google Translate, etc. And it's very complex and has lots of nodes and can yield some pretty good scores. So can semantic rules. In the second use case, out of the box, the rules-based gave you a precision of 93, and ultimately convolutional neural net won with a ranking of 97. And in the third use case, even after training, it turned out that the highest score was yielded by a semantic rules-based approach. What's particularly interesting about that, and this gets back to what we were talking about earlier with respect to training set sizes, is the blue line is the semantic rule version, and its score is the same from the get-go on out, whereas the other methods are machine learning based and they require training sets, and their accuracy increases as you increase the amount of training documents. And it's more than just training documents. Let's not forget, there are data scientists who are looking at the results and ensuring that you're using the right training data and you're applying it properly, and you're not overfitting to the particular problem. So for a number of these, so the example on the left in that use case, it was only after 15,000 or so training set documents had been applied to convolutional neural net that it equaled what was achieved out of the box from semantic rules. And the example on the left, semantic rules was a little bit lower than support vector machine from the get-go. And it was only after, again, about 5,000 training documents that convolutional neural net overtook it. So this tended to convince me that we're not the only ones who've seen these results. These sorts of results, and this is not product specific, but these sorts of results tell us that even though machine learning these days is like the hottest thing when it comes to natural language processing, there are other approaches that yield perfectly fine results with considerably less work. And that's what has convinced us to focus so much on using active navigation in our work at Iron Mountain. Steve?
You summed it up perfectly, Gary.
All right.
So
go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So some takeaways or to leave you with from conclusions from what we've been discussing today is the number one thing I would say to you all is you don't need to have all the answers up front, because no one has all the answers up front. Being able to build a data map, data inventory, however you'd like to describe it, and better understand what data you really have, what it's about, will set the foundations for success, for successful data classification. You have to be able to understand what you have in order to be able to make decisions on what to do with that data moving forwards. Likewise, I'm reading a fascinating book about why generalists succeed in a specialized world. And there's a great danger, and we've seen this with many, many customers, where they have such a narrow focus on what this should be about that they lose the breadth. And by losing the breadth, organizations are fluid, people are different. Again, it plays into understand what you have so you can make informed decisions based on what you really have rather than what that very narrow focus says it should be. Because as you saw with the scattergram chart, you can end up with a lot of blurred edges that make it very confusing. And by being able to understand what you have means that you can start building out processes and methodologies and repeatable processes and minimizing the disruption to the business, but based on cold, hard facts, not on what people in the organization say, this is the answer, when actually the data doesn't correlate exactly. Gary.
Yeah, and this is not to say that the choice becomes binary. You can use an approach like this one to go and, for classification purposes, clean up your corpus, classify against your retention schedule and against privacy requirements, and be in excellent shape and be compliant. But there are many other things in this day and age that people want to use their data for. And for many of those other use cases, machine learning of one type or another is the way they want to go. But as you've seen from the examples we've given, doing the initial cleanup and classification of your corpus using semantic rules is a great way to jumpstart whatever other project you're trying to look at, where you're trying to distill actionable business information out of an unstructured corpus. So one is not to the exclusion of the other, but I think that semantic learning is a great preliminary step to take. And finally, to speed this up, we've arranged with Active Navigation for our records retention taxonomies to be licensed directly as part of using Active Navigation software. ActiveNav is actually now a reseller of our retention taxonomies. You don't get all the legal research and all of the retention conclusions in a full retention schedule, but you get the functional areas, the record classes, the typical record examples that would be in an Iron Mountain retention schedule. So you can jumpstart this whole process much more quickly and easily.
So just before we move on, Gary, Jasmine has asked a great question in terms of, can we speak to how important it is for the records folks and IT folks to work together? And 100% agree with that, because the decisions made on data within an organization don't just impact IT and don't just impact the records folks, it impacts the organization. And so from our perspective, having key stakeholder support, buy-in and committee to approve all the different processes. So getting all the stakeholders together to try and get as much consensus as possible is super important. Because I think pretty much every instance we come across, IT will look at this from an IT perspective, not from an information criticality perspective. And so quite often there can be disconnects between what IT says is a solution to manage this problem and what the business says, this is how we need to solve this problem. And so engaging with the business, doing that legwork to bring people on is so important to the success of any of these projects, and acting as that interface or that glue to make sure that you're bringing people along on the journey rather than this is something that's being done to them is going to significantly impact the success of any particular project. Anything to add there, Gary?
No, I agree completely. I don't have anything to add to that.
Oh, and Jasmine has actually asked another great question.
Good. Let's go, Jasmine.
How vital is it to have a grip on O365 features for retention prior to diving in?
This is your favorite topic, Steve, so I'll let you.
It most certainly is, and I know we're running out of time. I could talk all afternoon on this one. But the reality here again is the O365, I think Jasmine summed it up. It's a feature for retention. It's not a solution. And so it's beholden, or the organization has the ability to control how a solution is implemented rather than having to retrofit business processes to technology. And therefore, what we have the ability to be able to do is, by building that data map and having an understanding of the data, means it can inform what the Office 365, Microsoft 365 environment really needs to look like, and how that can be configured and set up in such a way that we can apply retention or data security labels in order to take advantage of all the great features and capabilities that Microsoft is making available, but until this point, really relies on manual user intervention. And therefore, being able to carry out this legwork to understand about the data, to look at how that data is structured, or better ways of structuring it, actually drive the success of the platform and of the program. And so being able to drive that means you don't have to have all the answers available the moment you start the program. Using software such as ActiveNav and Iron Mountain's capabilities means that we can do that journey together, and it's a stepwise progression. Again, don't try and eat that elephant all in one sitting. It's a journey, and that journey will evolve over time. So it's not going to remain the same, but we can come up with repeatable processes that minimize that disruption and ensure the greatest chances of success.
Now we get to the part of the program where we insert a little commercial message. But Steve, I'd like to change it up a little bit. Let me tell everybody why I think ActiveNav is terrific, and then you can talk about Iron Mountain. So this is all that Active Navigation does, and they've been doing it for, what, 20 years now? They help customers manage their information, specifically their unstructured information, and specifically using this marvelous tool set. They don't do e-discovery. They don't do all sorts of other things. Every day, this is all they think about, and they do it really, really well, is their customer list, and that's just a small number of customers demonstrates.
And honestly, I didn't give Gary a script to read from to say that.
All right, it's your turn. Don't embarrass me.
Okay. And why do we partner with Iron Mountain, and why is Iron Mountain so important in this process? First of all, I'm sure everyone has heard of Iron Mountain, whether that is from the storage of paper and the legacy of, again, dealing with records management from the ground up, having the foundation, having policies and processes, owning a lot of the largest customers globally, and understanding the problems and challenges means that marrying the ActiveNav software together with the Iron Mountain expertise and knowledge means that we can offer a truly compelling and repeatable program and solution to clients in order to undertake these very, very difficult challenges where there are so many failed programs and projects. Between ActiveNav and Iron Mountain, we bring the best of both worlds that will ensure or give the greatest chance of project success.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Gary. That was fantastic. We do have just one question that wasn't addressed yet, so we'll wrap up with that. And that is, what are some tips for sustaining classification efforts? So in other words, how can you ensure that all the work you're putting in up front sticks in the long run with your end users? Great question.
And I would say this comes into the analogy I always use. People, and my wife is bored of hearing this, but it's very much like cleaning out your garage. If you do it once and structure it and organize it, looks great. You sit back, have a beer, think that was good. And then do nothing for 6 months, which is what happens. And then my wife nags me again. And it's a big mess again. And we have to redo the whole thing. So whatever you do, don't think of this as one and done. Once we've tackled that huge legacy problem, you want to sustain and maintain good governance of data moving forwards. And while platforms such as Microsoft 365 and others have some capability to help manage that, there's also an element of taking all the learning and experience and the rules that have been produced to get to that good governance stage with the legacy data to look at maintaining that ongoing. So on a periodic basis, and the frequency can depend on the volatility or importance of the data that's being pointed at, you want to be able to profile that data to make sure it's being managed effectively day forward. But the important thing is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You're looking at what's changed and making sure that users are either tagging data correctly, or we can say, based on the rules that we use for the legacy data that was successful, actually this has been tagged a certain way, but we think that the tag should really be this, so that you can manage by exception. So again, you certainly don't want to repeat the whole process, but you do want to sustain the good governance, because if you don't, you will get into a world of pain very, very quickly again.
Wonderful. Anything to add, Gary?
A couple of things quickly. I have these 11 rules for e-record success I use all the time. I'll hit a couple of the high points. Email me if you want the full list. Start out with fewer categories and bigger buckets. You can always subdivide them later, but it's easier to start by classifying into larger, more clearly defined categories. Second, as much as I love file analysis tools like Active Navigation, if you can have classified records drop out of a business process as a natural artifact of that business process using workflow software or by managing the structured information before it gets dumped into a file share, then do that. It's easier, it's faster, it's less expensive. Regardless of, even if you try and do those things, you're still going to end up with a fair amount of what I call records in the wild, and you're going to need an active navigation in order to classify them. But those are just some of the things I think you can do to manage the entire environment around unstructured records.
Thank you all for your questions. Steve and Gary's contact information is up on the screen, and we really appreciate your time. Thank you from everyone here at ActiveNav and Iron Mountain. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.